The sun had barely begun to rise, casting a soft, eerie glow over the remains of the once thriving city of Seattle. The streets were littered with abandoned cars, broken windows, and the faintest echoes of a world that had slipped into oblivion. Once a bustling hub of innovation, culture, and life, it now stood as a symbol of humanity's fall, a hushed testament to the chaos that had taken over the earth. Jackson Matthews sat at the broken edge of a concrete building, staring out over the crumbling skyline. His hand gripped the worn stock of his rifle, his knuckles white from tension. Behind him, his small group of survivors moved silently, gathering supplies for what might be their last expedition into the heart of the city. Every decision weighed heavily on Jackson's mind. He had led them this far, but the looming question remained, could they continue to survive? The world had changed so quickly, so violently, that most had barely realized what was happening until it was too late. The virus, as they'd come to call it, had spread like wildfire. What started as isolated incidents turned into global devastation. Cities fell. Governments crumbled. And then came the creatures, twisted, relentless versions of the living, mindlessly driven by hunger. Jackson wasn't sure how many survivors were left in the world. He had seen the signs: desperation, anger, and fear on the faces of people who used to be his friends, his neighbors. And the creatures? The zombies, the infected, they were everywhere, growing in number, evolving in ways no one had predicted. No one knew how the infection worked, how it spread so quickly, but one thing was certain: dead America was gone. Jackson called out a voice from behind him. It was Claire, one of the few remaining members of their group. Her face was streaked with dirt, her clothes tattered from days of travel. She walked up beside him, offering a tired smile. "We're ready to move out when you are." Jackson nodded, taking a deep breath. "All right. Let's get to the supply depot. We'll take the back alleys, less chance of being seen. If we're lucky, we'll find enough food and ammo to last us another week." The group had no illusions about their chances of survival. They were used to living on the edge. There were no more rules, no more safe zones. Only the fight. And, if they were lucky, a glimmer of hope. The wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the scent of decay and the remnants of fires that had once burned fiercely in an effort to fight back against the undead. It was a desolate landscape, but in it, the survivors had found a new sense of determination. The fear, while still present, had given way to a more primal need: survival. As they made their way through the shadows of abandoned buildings, Jackson's thoughts turned to his wife, Sarah, and their young daughter, Lily. He had promised them both he would keep them safe. But promises were hard to keep when the world was unraveling. He couldn't shake the thought that he might never see them again. "Are we sure about this?" Claire asked, her voice cutting through the silence. "The depot is a dead zone now. We might not make it out alive." Jackson met her gaze. He could see the worry in her eyes, but there was also something else. Resolve. They all had it now. "We don't have a choice. If we don't find something soon, we'll starve, or worse." Claire didn't argue. They had all come to the same conclusion, each of them understanding the brutal reality of their situation. Every day was a gamble. But they had made it this far. The group moved with practiced stealth, keeping low, avoiding the open streets as they entered the heart of the city. Their footsteps were muffled against the rubble, and their breaths were shallow as they crept through the alleys. The world was quiet, too quiet, but the occasional groan in the distance reminded them that they were never truly alone. The zombies were out there, lurking, always hungry. Suddenly, a sound pierced the silence. It was faint at first, like the rustling of a wind-blown piece of paper, but it quickly grew louder. Footsteps. Too many to ignore. Jackson motioned for the group to stop. His heart raced. His mind screamed for action, but he knew they had to remain calm. If they panicked now, they were dead. They pressed themselves against the nearest building, hearts pounding as they waited. The footsteps grew closer. Shadows flitted across the narrow alley, and Jackson's grip tightened on his rifle. A figure emerged into view, and for a moment, Jackson thought it was just another survivor. But as the figure stepped closer, he saw the telltale signs, the strange, jerky movements, the pale, decaying skin. It was one of them. "Zombies," whispered Claire, her voice trembling with fear. Jackson's mind raced. They couldn't afford to engage in a fight. They had to keep moving. But as more figures emerged from the shadows, he realized the odds were against them. They had no choice but to fight. "On my signal," he murmured, tightening his grip on the rifle. "We fight, we survive. No matter what." The survivors readied their weapons, the tension palpable in the air. Their fates were now tied to each other, and there was only one thing left to do: survive. The distant shuffle of the undead grew louder, their grotesque forms moving erratically through the alleyway. Jackson's eyes flicked to Claire, then to the others. Their faces were grim, but there was a fire in their eyes. They were ready. There was no turning back now. "Get ready," Jackson whispered. "Stay close, and don't stop moving unless I say so." He could hear his own heart pounding in his chest, each beat a reminder of how fragile their existence had become. The days of relying on anyone other than themselves were long gone. The group's trust had been forged through fire, through days and nights of hardship and close calls. If they were to survive this, it would be together. The first zombie came into view. It shuffled aimlessly, its skin sagging and its eyes vacant. Its mouth hung open in an eternal snarl, drool dripping from its lips. Jackson's hand tightened around his rifle, the cold steel of the weapon steadying his nerves. "Take the one on the left," Jackson instructed Claire, his voice low but firm. Without a word, Claire raised her crossbow and aimed at the first undead. She was quick, too quick for the creature to react, and with a single shot, the bolt embedded deep into the zombie's skull. It dropped like a rag doll, its limp body crumpling to the ground with a sickening thud. The others followed suit. They were moving in sync, the years of training and practice with their weapons paying off. Shots rang out, a muffled series of cracks that echoed through the alley as the survivors picked off one undead after another. But there were too many. Every corner they turned, another group of zombies appeared, shuffling and stumbling toward them with horrifying determination. Jackson's thoughts raced. They had to keep moving, but there was no way they could keep fighting forever. With every zombie they killed, more seemed to take its place. This was a losing battle. They needed to get to the depot and fast. If they stayed here any longer, the horde would overwhelm them. "Move out!" Jackson yelled, signaling the group to fall back. The survivors retreated into a narrow passageway, their movements quick and calculated. Claire led the way, her crossbow still trained on the approaching undead. Behind her, Jackson kept a close eye on the group, scanning every shadow for signs of movement. As they turned the corner, the pressure on their backs grew. More zombies poured into the alley, their heads turning, eyes locked on the scent of living flesh. The survivors picked up the pace, running now, their breath coming in quick, labored gasps. Jackson cursed under his breath. They had to make it to the depot. If they could just get to the weapons cache, they'd stand a chance. They'd have enough firepower to hold off the zombies for a while, maybe even take the fight back to the horde. But as they reached the end of the alley and rounded another corner, they were met with a sight that sent a chill through Jackson's bones. A wall of zombies blocked the path, their bloated bodies pressing together like a writhing sea of death. He stopped dead in his tracks. The others behind him skidded to a halt, but it was too late. They were trapped. "Damn it," muttered Claire. "We've got no choice but to fight." Jackson's pulse quickened. He glanced at his group, his mind running through 1,000 possibilities. The wall of zombies ahead was far too thick to break through, and they were too close to the depot for the horde to let them slip away unnoticed. "We can't fight them all," he said, his voice taut. "We'll be overrun. We need to draw them away." Claire looked at him, understanding flickering in her eyes. "How?" Jackson's eyes scanned the alley ahead, searching for anything they could use to their advantage. And then he saw it. A car, half turned on its side, with a large gasoline tank still attached. It was a long shot, but it was their only shot. "We need to get to that car," Jackson said, pointing. I'll create a diversion. You two, cover me. Claire nodded, her face set in determination. Let's do it. Jackson took a deep breath, his grip tightening around the rifle as he led the charge. He fired a few shots into the air, hoping to attract the zombies' attention. The noise was enough. Slowly, the undead began to shuffle toward them, their empty eyes locked on the sounds of life. Now! Jackson shouted. They sprinted toward the car, moving with all the speed they could muster. Behind them, the horde was growing closer, their guttural growls filling the air. Every step felt like it might be their last. Jackson reached the car first, crouching behind it for cover. Claire and the others joined him quickly, taking their positions. On my mark, Jackson whispered, his finger hovering over the trigger. As the zombies grew closer, Jackson's mind sharpened. There was no room for hesitation now. They had one shot at this. One shot to survive. 3, 2, 1. He pulled the trigger, sending a shot into the car's fuel tank. The explosion was deafening. A fiery burst of light erupted from the wreckage, sending a shockwave that sent the nearest zombies stumbling backward. The blast ignited the air, and for a moment, everything was chaos. But it worked. The horde turned, following the new scent of burning flesh. Jackson and his group had bought themselves a moment of precious time. Move! Jackson yelled, already running. They were not out of danger yet. But for now, they were alive. And that was enough. The explosion's echo still rumbled in their ears as Jackson and the group sprinted through the smoky alley. Their breaths were sharp and ragged, their feet pounding against the cracked pavement, the sound drowned out by the ever-present groans and hisses of the undead. But for the first time in what felt like ages, they had a small victory, a momentary reprieve. As they rounded another corner, Claire shouted, "There! The depot! We're almost there!" Jackson's heart raced. His eyes locked onto the old, rusted warehouse in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. The depot was their final hope of finding enough weapons and supplies to keep the fight going. Without it, they'd be sitting ducks, waiting for the horde to tear them apart. Move, move, move! Jackson barked, his voice low but urgent. They pushed forward, adrenaline fueling their every step, the fear of being overtaken pushing them faster. But as they neared the entrance to the depot, a terrible realization hit Jackson like a ton of bricks. The doors were wide open. Too wide. Something's wrong, he muttered, stopping in his tracks. His instincts screamed that they were walking into a trap, but there was no time for hesitation. He had to make a decision. Claire stepped up beside him, her expression tense. What do you think? Should we go in? Jackson squinted into the depot. The shadows inside were thick and impenetrable, but he could make out a few shapes, movement. He wasn't sure if they were survivors or zombies, but something in the way they shifted sent a chill down his spine. We go in, he said, the words escaping his lips like a command. But we stay alert. Weapons out. Keep your distance. The group nodded in unison, drawing their weapons and entering the depot cautiously. The interior was a mess, boxes of supplies scattered across the floor, half-open crates, and remnants of what looked like an abandoned camp. The stench of rot filled the air, a mixture of stale food and decay. But there was no time to dwell on it. Every corner could hide a threat. Jackson led the group deeper, his eyes scanning the shadows, his mind calculating the risks. The depot was eerily quiet, and he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching them. Suddenly, a low growl reverberated through the walls, followed by a series of eerie groans. The group froze, their weapons raised, as the unmistakable shuffle of the undead reached their ears. There they are, whispered Claire, her voice tight with fear. A small group of zombies emerged from the darkened corners of the depot, their pale faces twisted in grotesque expressions, their mouths opening and closing in hungry anticipation. But these weren't the slow-moving, lumbering creatures they were used to. These zombies were faster, more agile, their movements almost too coordinated. Jackson's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. "They're evolving," he murmured, his eyes narrowing. "These ones are different." Before anyone could react, the first zombie lunged toward them. Claire fired her crossbow, the bolt piercing the creature's skull. It dropped, but not before the others surged forward, snapping and clawing at the air. "Fall back!" Jackson yelled. They turned and ran, but the depot was a maze of crates and stacked supplies. Every turn they took seemed to lead them further into the heart of the building, and every step they took seemed to draw the zombies closer. The survivors fired in quick succession, picking off the closest zombies one by one. But for each one that fell, two more seemed to take its place, pouring out of the shadows with terrifying speed. "We're running out of ammo," shouted Peter, one of the newer members of the group, his voice panicked as he fired his handgun at a zombie's head. "We need to get out of here." Jackson's mind raced. The door they had entered through was behind them, but it might as well have been miles away. They couldn't afford to turn back. They had to find another way out, or they'd be trapped in this hellhole. "Up there!" Claire shouted, pointing to a catwalk above them. It was narrow, but it offered the chance to escape the hordes below. Jackson didn't hesitate. "Everyone up! Now!" He and Claire were the first to reach the catwalk, climbing quickly, pulling themselves up with whatever strength they had left. Behind them, the rest of the group scrambled to follow, but the zombies were closing in faster than they could climb. Jackson reached down to help pull Peter up, but the young man was struggling. His leg had been grazed by one of the zombies, and blood was trickling down his pant leg. Panic flooded Peter's eyes as the creatures approached. "Come on!" Claire shouted, but Peter's body was frozen, caught between fear and the sheer will to survive. Without thinking, Jackson reached down and yanked Peter up by the arm, ignoring the strain in his own muscles. Together, they pulled him to safety just as a zombie grabbed Peter's ankle. A shot rang out, and the creature dropped, but not without taking a chunk of Peter's clothing with it. "Move!" Jackson shouted, urgency in his voice. The survivors scrambled onto the catwalk, but there were more zombies behind them now, too many to count, flooding into the open space below. Their growls filled the air, echoing off the walls, a cacophony of hunger and death. The survivors could only run, their hearts pounding as they climbed higher, the catwalk creaking under their weight. But as they reached the top, a horrifying sound shattered the air. The sound of something larger, heavier, moving in the shadows. "Get ready," Jackson whispered, bracing for what was to come. They had no idea what they were about to face, but one thing was certain: the fight for survival was far from over. The sound reverberated through the catwalk, sending a chill down everyone's spine. It wasn't the typical shuffle of the undead, nor the usual growls they had grown accustomed to over the past few years. No, this sound was different, too deliberate, too heavy. Jackson's blood ran cold as he realized they weren't just dealing with the same old zombies anymore. "Stay alert," he hissed, his voice barely audible over the creaking of the catwalk. The group moved cautiously, inching their way toward a doorway at the far end of the platform. They needed to get out of this section of the depot. Whatever was lurking in the shadows down below was not something they were prepared for. Claire glanced over her shoulder, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" she whispered. Her voice trembled, and Jackson could see the uncertainty on her face. She had faced down hordes of zombies before, but whatever was making that noise was something entirely new. "I don't know," Jackson replied, his grip tightening on his rifle. "But it's not something we want to meet head-on." Suddenly, the growls stopped. The air was thick with tension, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, uneven, but unmistakably purposeful, echoed up from below. Something was coming. Jackson motioned for the group to move quickly, his eyes darting around for any way to escape. They had reached the door, but it was locked. He tried the handle, but it didn't budge. He kicked it with a heavy boot, but still nothing. "Damn it," he muttered, banging on the door with the butt of his rifle. The others crowded around, looking for another way out. "Jackson," Claire whispered urgently, her hand on his shoulder. "What if?" Before she could finish her thought, a loud crash shook the room. The catwalk trembled as if something massive had just impacted the floor below. Jackson's head whipped around, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, he saw it. A hulking figure, its skin taut and stretched over bloated muscles, emerged from the shadows. Its eyes were a glowing yellow, its mouth gaping open with jagged teeth protruding from its gums. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its movements were too fluid for a normal zombie. This was no ordinary undead. It was something worse. Is that? Claire's voice trailed off, her eyes wide with disbelief. It's a mutant, Jackson said grimly. His mind raced with the implications. A mutation, a new breed of zombie, faster, stronger, smarter. And from the looks of it, this creature was more than just a mindless killer. It was a predator. The mutant zombie let out an ear-piercing screech, a noise that sent a wave of panic through the group. It was like nothing they had ever heard before. And then it charged, its massive legs propelling it toward the catwalk with terrifying speed. Move! Jackson yelled. They ran, adrenaline pushing their bodies beyond their limits. Jackson could hear the creature's growls getting louder, its footsteps growing heavier. The mutant wasn't just chasing them, it was hunting them. Claire fired her crossbow, the bolt hitting the mutant in the chest, but it barely slowed down. The creature roared in fury, its monstrous form leaping toward them. Jackson raised his rifle and fired, aiming for the head, but the mutant seemed impervious to the bullets. It wasn't like the other zombies. This thing was evolving, adapting, and it was stronger than anything they had faced before. Keep moving! Jackson shouted as he turned to face the others. We need to get to the other side of the building. Now! They ran, their footsteps echoing through the catwalk as the mutant pursued them relentlessly. It was closing the distance, its monstrous form growing ever closer with each passing second. Ahead, Jackson saw another door. It was their only chance. He pushed through the group, taking the lead once more. Claire! Peter, he yelled, urging them to keep up. We're almost there. But as they neared the door, a horrifying sound rang out from below, the unmistakable scrape of claws on concrete. Jackson's blood ran cold. They weren't alone. The mutant wasn't the only threat in the depot. From the shadows below, a dozen or more zombies, faster and more aggressive than any they had faced before, climbed out of the dark corners, their glowing eyes fixed on the survivors. Not again, Peter muttered, his voice tinged with fear. But there was no time to dwell on it. The group reached the door, and Jackson kicked it open with a powerful shove. The light from the outside world flooded in, momentarily blinding them. But the safety of the daylight was too far out of reach. They rushed outside, but the mutant was right behind them, its screeches filling the air. It was gaining on them, its huge legs pushing it faster than any zombie they had encountered. As they ran through the open space, Jackson could hear the others breathing heavily, their panic starting to build. There's no way we can outrun it, Claire said, her voice strained. It's too fast. We have to make it to the vehicle, Jackson said through gritted teeth. It's our only shot. The survivors ran toward an old, beat-up truck parked near the edge of the depot. But before they could get close enough, the mutant lunged forward, its monstrous claws scraping across the pavement as it reached for them. Jackson fired a few shots in desperation, but the creature barely flinched. It was too powerful, too fast. Get in the truck, he shouted, pushing Claire toward the door. With a final burst of energy, they made it to the truck, jumping inside and slamming the doors shut just as the mutant reached out for them. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the roar of the engine cut through the silence, and they sped off, leaving the depot behind. But Jackson knew, deep down, this wasn't over. The mutant wasn't going to stop. It was just the beginning of something far worse. And they were now in the fight of their lives. The truck's tires screeched against the cracked pavement as Jackson slammed his foot down on the gas pedal. The engine roared to life, sending them hurtling away from the depot, but the adrenaline coursing through their veins couldn't mask the creeping dread settling in the pit of Jackson's stomach. They were not out of danger. Not by a long shot. Behind them, the sound of the mutant's screeches echoed through the air, a terrible reminder of the relentless pursuit they were now a part of. It wasn't just the creature that haunted Jackson's thoughts, though, it was the knowledge that they weren't the only ones fighting to survive. The world had changed in ways they were only just beginning to understand. Jackson glanced over at Claire, her eyes wide with shock. She gripped the edge of the truck's seat, her knuckles white as she tried to steady herself. How did that thing even exist?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, we've seen the undead evolve, but that wasn't like anything we've faced before." "I don't know," Jackson admitted, his eyes focused on the road ahead. His mind raced, calculating their next move. They had to keep moving, had to put as much distance between them and that mutant as possible. But the thought of what they had just encountered gnawed at him. Mutants. Faster. Stronger. Smarter. What other horrors had the virus unleashed? "We're not safe yet," he said, his words harsh with urgency. "That thing's going to follow us, and we need to be ready for it. It might even be leading a whole new group of infected." Claire's eyes flicked nervously to the rearview mirror, but she saw nothing but the fading outline of the depot. The road behind them was empty, at least for now. "Do you think we can outrun it?" Peter asked from the back seat, his voice shaky. The fear in his eyes was palpable, but it was the same fear that everyone shared now. They were no longer in control of their fate. "No," Jackson replied firmly. "We can't outrun it, not on this road. It's too fast. But I've got a plan. There's a bridge up ahead. We'll turn off and head into the old industrial district. If we can get to the old factories, we might be able to fortify a place to hold out for a while." "Factories? That sounds dangerous," Claire said, glancing nervously at the passing landscape. "What if there are more of those things there?" "We'll cross that bridge when we get to it," Jackson answered, his jaw tightening as he focused on the road. His grip on the wheel tightened as he veered toward a fork in the road, the only way to head toward the industrial district. But as they rounded the corner, they caught sight of something that made Jackson's heart race with even more fear: smoke. Thick black plumes of smoke rising into the air. "That can't be good," Peter muttered. "It's too close to the industrial district," Claire said, her eyes narrowing. "Do you think the government's setting up another quarantine zone?" "I don't think so," Jackson said grimly. "I think someone out there is fighting back. And that's probably why it's burning. But right now, our biggest concern is what's chasing us." The distant screech of the mutant's roar reached their ears again, a sound that made Jackson's skin crawl. He forced himself to focus on the road ahead, but his mind kept returning to the same, terrifying thought: if that mutant had evolved, what else had? Jackson accelerated, the truck barreling down the road as they neared the bridge. It looked far too narrow for the large, hulking mutant, but it wasn't the mutant that Jackson was worried about. The sound of a different roar, one that vibrated through the ground, reached them just as they approached the bridge. "Shit," Jackson swore, his eyes darting to the horizon. "It's here." A massive group of zombies, more than Jackson had ever seen in one place, appeared at the edge of the bridge, emerging from the smoke. Unlike the usual, slow-moving undead, these creatures were moving fast, running with a terrifying speed and coordination. Their eyes glowed in the dim light, and their movements were precise, purposeful. "Turn around!" Claire shouted. "Turn the truck around!" But Jackson was already making the decision. "Hang on," he yelled, swerving the truck onto the narrow bridge. The truck's tires screeched against the metal, and for a split second, Jackson thought they might go over the edge. The mutant's roar grew louder. It was closing in fast. Jackson slammed his foot down, flooring the gas pedal, as the bridge stretched out in front of them. They were running out of time. If the mutant caught up, there was no way they could fight it head-on. But if they could just get across the bridge... Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the air, followed by the deafening screech of metal scraping against metal. The sound of their tires sliding over the old bridge intensified as Jackson desperately fought to keep control of the vehicle. A massive shadow loomed behind them. The mutant was almost upon them. "Go!" Jackson shouted, his eyes locked on the road ahead. We can't let it catch us now. But just as they neared the end of the bridge, something broke through the smoke in front of them. A wall of zombies, faster than any they had ever seen before, surged forward, blocking their path. Jackson slammed the brakes, the truck sliding to a halt inches away from the oncoming horde. The sound of the mutants' roars grew louder in the distance. No choice, Jackson muttered. We fight. They were surrounded. The final battle had begun. The truck's engine hummed faintly in the background, its idle sound a stark contrast to the growing chaos. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of how close they were to being overwhelmed. The horde was closing in on them from all sides, their glowing eyes fixated on the survivors. Their grotesque forms swayed like a grotesque tide, pushing closer with every passing second. Get out, Jackson ordered, his voice low but commanding. We fight here. Claire and Peter exchanged a tense glance. They knew it was a last-ditch effort. There were too many of them, too many to outrun, and the truck was their last lifeline. If they stayed inside, they would be trapped. The mutant wasn't far behind, and the swarm of zombies on the bridge was only growing larger. Are you crazy? Claire snapped, her voice cracking under the pressure. We'll never make it. We're surrounded. Jackson's grip tightened around his rifle, the familiar weight offering him some sense of control in the chaos. He turned to face her, eyes burning with determination. We don't have a choice. If we stay in this truck, they'll tear us apart. But if we fight our way through, there's a chance we can make it. We've survived worse, haven't we? Claire opened her mouth to protest but closed it again, her shoulders slumping in resignation. She knew he was right. Peter, you're with me, Jackson said, his voice hard and unwavering. Claire, you cover our backs. Peter nodded, gripping his machete tightly, his knuckles white with fear. Claire didn't respond immediately, but she pulled her crossbow from its holster, loading it with a bolt. She was terrified, but she wasn't going to let her fear paralyze her. Not now. We're gonna need to move fast, Jackson continued, his eyes scanning the horde. The zombies were closing in from all sides, but they weren't rushing to attack just yet. They moved with an eerie coordination, as though they were waiting for something. The air was thick with tension, the stillness before the storm. On my mark, Jackson said, his voice steady. We push through the right flank. Follow my lead. The survivors stepped out of the truck, their boots hitting the concrete with a muted thud. The sound was enough to draw the attention of the nearest zombies, and with a guttural growl, they turned to face their new targets. Jackson didn't hesitate. He fired first, a single shot that rang out into the silence. The bullet struck the skull of the nearest zombie, sending it stumbling back into the horde behind it. The rest of the zombies seemed momentarily stunned, but then, they began to surge forward with renewed aggression. Move! Jackson shouted, his voice carrying over the chaos. Peter was the first to rush into the fray, slashing his machete through the air in a deadly arc. The blade connected with a zombie's shoulder, severing the arm with a sickening squelch. The creature stumbled, but Peter didn't hesitate, he drove the machete into its skull, ending its miserable existence. Claire's crossbow fired with deadly precision, sending bolt after bolt into the heads of zombies that came too close. Her aim was steady, each shot clean and true. But she could feel the panic rising in her chest as more and more zombies pressed in on them. The smell of decay was overwhelming, a sharp, sickly odor that made her stomach churn. The mutant screech echoed over the bridge again, sending a new wave of terror through them. The creature was getting closer. We need to clear the way. Jackson shouted, firing his rifle into the mass of zombies ahead. The shots were precise, but the group of undead was relentless. There were so many of them, they seemed to multiply with every step they took. As Jackson aimed for the next zombie, something in the distance caught his eye. The mutant was moving fast, too fast. It had crossed the bridge and was barreling toward them with a terrifying speed. It was closer than he had feared. We're not going to last much longer like this. Claire shouted, her voice laced with panic. Jackson's heart sank. The mutants' pace wasn't slowing down, and the horde was only growing in number. They couldn't keep this up forever. They needed a way out, and fast. Plan B. Jackson yelled. Get to the truck. We're using it as cover. They began to fall back toward the truck, moving quickly but cautiously, each of them dispatching zombies as they moved. Jackson fired a few more shots, clearing the immediate path ahead. But even as they made their retreat, the mutant was gaining on them. Come on. Hurry. Jackson shouted, urging them to move faster. Claire's crossbow shot went wide, missing its target as a zombie lunged at her. She managed to shove it back with a swift kick to the chest, but it was a close call. Peter slashed through another zombie's neck, but the horde seemed endless. Finally, they reached the truck, clambering into the cab with a collective sigh of relief. But their brief moment of respite was shattered as the mutant came into view, its massive form bursting through the throngs of undead. The truck's engine roared to life as Jackson slammed his foot on the pedal. The mutant was too close, and the survivors had no choice but to accelerate. They barreled through the remaining zombies, the truck's tires skidding over their lifeless bodies. Jackson looked into the rearview mirror, his heart hammering in his chest as the mutant gave chase, still sprinting toward them. But then, something unexpected happened. The mutant stopped. Jackson's grip on the wheel tightened as the mutant paused just before the edge of the bridge, its glowing yellow eyes fixed on them. The screech it let out was deafening, but it didn't pursue. It just stood there, watching them, as if calculating its next move. What the hell? Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Jackson didn't have time to think about it. They had to keep moving. They were still in danger, but for the moment, they were safe. For now. As they drove off into the night, the bridge growing smaller in the rearview mirror, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they had just encountered was only the beginning. The true nightmare was just starting. You said. The night air was thick with tension as the truck barreled down the cracked highway, its headlights cutting through the fog that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Jackson's mind raced, but no matter how fast he drove, he couldn't outrun the unease settling over him. The mutant had stopped, only for a moment, but that brief pause had haunted him. It was as if the creature was making a deliberate choice, a decision that had far more meaning than he could comprehend. The road ahead was desolate, and the absence of sound except for the truck's engine made it feel as though the world itself had fallen silent. But Jackson knew better. He knew that silence was just another predator's lullaby. Are we seriously safe now? Claire's voice broke the silence, her tone a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. She was slumped in the passenger seat, her fingers tight around the crossbow she still held. Safe? Jackson repeated, glancing at her for a second before his eyes returned to the road. For now, yes. But we can't drop our guard. You think it's just gonna leave us alone? Claire asked, her voice tinged with sarcasm. That thing's too big, too fast. It won't just forget about us. I know, Jackson admitted, a sense of dread pooling in his stomach. But we don't know what it wants. It might be waiting for something, or it could be. His words were interrupted by a low, guttural noise that came from the back seat. Peter shifted uneasily, his face pale in the dim light. What if it's tracking us? He asked, his voice shaking. It's not just the mutants, is it? There's something worse out here, something we don't understand yet. Jackson's grip on the wheel tightened. Peter was right. There was an intelligence behind this attack. The way the mutant had hesitated, calculated, before stopping made Jackson realize that they were no longer facing mindless creatures. Whatever had happened in the world had changed not just the infected, but the very rules of survival. What if the virus is evolving? Jackson murmured, more to himself than anyone else. What if it's not just making the dead rise, it's changing them, turning them into something we can't fight with the same old weapons? Claire's eyes narrowed as she looked at Jackson, her brow furrowing. That's a terrifying thought. You think these mutants could be smarter? Like, they have a purpose? I don't know, Jackson said, his voice grim. But whatever it is, we're in the middle of it. and we need to figure out how to stop it before we become part of the problem. The truck rumbled on through the fog, but Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. They had been driving for hours now, and he hadn't seen another soul. No other survivors. No other vehicles. Just empty, desolate streets. It wasn't just the eerie quiet of the surroundings that made him uneasy. It was the creeping sense that the world was no longer just a battlefield against the undead, it was a chessboard, and they were pawns in a game whose rules they couldn't even begin to understand. Suddenly, the truck hit a bump in the road, jolting everyone awake. Claire grabbed onto the edge of her seat, but Jackson didn't slow down. Instead, his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. A chill ran down his spine as he caught a glimpse of someone, moving in the darkness behind them. It was too fast to be a person, too coordinated to be a regular zombie. "Did you see that?" Peter asked, his voice cracking. "It's following us." Again. Jackson didn't need to answer. He could see it too now. The silhouette was unmistakable. The mutant wasn't far behind, and it was picking up speed, moving through the darkness like an unstoppable force. "Shit," Jackson swore under his breath. "Hold on tight. It's coming for us again." Claire's grip tightened on her crossbow, her knuckles white. "We can't outrun it, Jackson. What do we do now?" "Get ready," Jackson said, his voice low and resolute. "We're going to have to make a stand. I'll slow down when we hit that old overpass up ahead. We can fortify there." "Fortify?" Claire repeated, her tone incredulous. "How do we fortify against that thing? It's not like any of the other zombies we've fought." "I know," Jackson said, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the road. "But we have to try. We can't just keep running forever." The truck hit another bump, this time harder, and they all felt it. It felt like the ground beneath them was shaking, almost as if the entire world was about to collapse in on itself. Jackson slammed his foot down harder on the gas pedal. He needed to get them to the overpass, but the reality of their situation was weighing heavily on him. The mutant was getting closer, too close. He could hear it now, the pounding of its feet against the ground, the screeching sound that seemed to echo across the empty landscape. Whatever the thing was, it was fast, and it was coming for them. As they approached the overpass, Jackson didn't hesitate. He jerked the steering wheel, guiding the truck up the ramp to a small abandoned parking lot beneath the structure. There was no time to waste. They needed to make their stand here, and they needed to do it quickly. The truck came to a screeching halt, and Jackson threw it into park. They had seconds to prepare. "Get out," he barked, grabbing his rifle. "We fight here. This is our last chance." The group scrambled out of the truck, weapons at the ready. But even as they took their positions, something felt wrong. The mutant had stopped chasing them, not because it had given up, but because it was waiting for something. A bigger, more insidious force. Claire's eyes darted nervously. "We're not alone. Are we?" Jackson turned to face her, his expression grim. "No. I think we're about to find out." And at that moment, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble, and in the distance, the unmistakable sounds of a new, terrifying threat echoed through the air. The true enemy had arrived. The air was thick with the scent of decay, but the oppressive silence that had settled around the survivors was even more suffocating. Jackson's grip tightened around his rifle as he scanned their surroundings, the darkened overpass casting long shadows that seemed to creep ever closer. His heart pounded in his chest, the anticipation of the unknown pressing down on him like a vice. "We're not alone," Claire muttered under her breath, her eyes darting to the shadows around them. She had already reloaded her crossbow, her fingers steady despite the fear clouding her mind. The hairs on the back of her neck were standing on end, as though the very world around them was waiting for the inevitable. Peter's eyes were wide with panic, his breath shallow as he clutched his machete. "What's happening, Jackson? What the hell's out there?" "I don't know," Jackson answered, his voice low and calm despite the rising panic inside him. "But we're going to find out. Stay sharp." The sound of distant footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed through the parking lot, sending a chill through the survivors. It wasn't the quick, shambling walk of zombies, this was something different. Something more calculated. From the darkness, a figure emerged, its silhouette slowly taking shape. At first, it looked like just another mutant, but Jackson's instincts screamed at him that this wasn't the same. This one was bigger, towering, hulking in a way that made the previous mutants look like amateurs. It stepped into the light, and the survivors saw its face, a grotesque, twisted mockery of humanity, its eyes glowing with an unnerving yellow hue. But it wasn't just its size or its appearance that made Jackson's blood run cold. It was the way it moved, like it was in complete control of its surroundings, each step measured, its presence dominating the space. "Stay back," Jackson whispered, holding up a hand. He knew they couldn't afford to engage yet. Not until they understood what they were dealing with. But it wasn't just one. As the creature stepped forward, others followed behind it, more mutants, but these were different. They were taller, faster, and more coordinated, moving as if they were part of a greater whole, a terrifying army led by a single mastermind. It was clear now, they weren't just fighting random zombies. They were facing something far worse, something organized. "The mutants are evolving," Peter said in a low, fearful voice. "They're not just mindless killers anymore. They're hunting us." "Look at their eyes," Claire added, her voice shaky. "It's like they're aware. Like they know we're a threat." Jackson's grip on his rifle tightened, his mind racing. He didn't have the luxury of time. This was their last stand. If they didn't fight back now, they'd be overrun, consumed by the very creatures they'd spent so long trying to avoid. "Plan B," Jackson said quickly, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "We hold our ground. We take out as many as we can, but we need to stay mobile. They can't corner us." Claire and Peter nodded, ready to follow his lead. But Jackson could tell they were just as scared as he was. The odds were stacked against them, no one had prepared them for something like this. There were too many mutants, and they were too strong. They had no choice but to fight, even if it meant giving their lives for a chance at survival. The mutants began to move in, their grotesque forms lurching forward with unnatural speed. Jackson raised his rifle, aiming for the largest one, the leader, but before he could pull the trigger, a deafening screech filled the air. It wasn't the roar of a mutant, it was something far worse. Out of the shadows, another creature appeared. This one wasn't like the others. It was smaller, but it moved with a kind of unnatural fluidity. Its limbs were twisted and elongated, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes, bright, glowing yellow, locked onto Jackson as if it were sizing him up. "I thought we were done with these," Claire whispered, recognizing the creature for what it was. "It's a skinwalker. It's different." The skinwalker hissed, its mouth stretching into a grotesque grin. It moved with inhuman speed, darting toward them in the blink of an eye. Jackson barely had time to react. He fired his rifle, the bullet grazing the creature's arm, but it didn't seem to slow it down. The skinwalker lunged at Claire, but Peter swung his machete in a desperate arc, knocking the creature off course. It shrieked in fury, its eyes wild with rage. "Move!" Jackson shouted, pulling Claire back as he fired another round at the skinwalker, forcing it to retreat for the moment. But there was no time to think. The mutants were closing in from all sides, their eyes glinting in the dim light, their movements synchronized as they advanced. They were a relentless wave of death, and there was no escape. Not unless they fought back. "Get to the truck! We're making a run for it!" Jackson yelled. Without hesitation, they turned and sprinted toward the truck, the sound of the mutants' pursuit growing louder in their ears. But even as they ran, Jackson could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He didn't know if they could outrun these monsters. They had already faced horrors beyond their comprehension. But this was something different. The end was closing in on them, and their survival depended on outsmarting the enemy, something that was growing harder by the minute. As the truck doors slammed shut behind them, Jackson's hands trembled as he started the engine. The creatures were moments away, and he wasn't sure they'd make it. But he had one thing left: hope. They tore down the highway, the creatures still in pursuit, but the fog ahead promised one thing: a new horizon. The survivors hadn't given up yet. And in a world where humanity had fallen, that might be enough. The final reckoning had only just begun.